Alright, let's rewind to the beginning, shall we? The year is 1902. A young fella named Benito Mussolini, not exactly a fan of mandatory military service, decides to pack his bags and flee Italy for the scenic landscapes of Switzerland. It's here he dives headfirst into the world of violent socialism. His new hobby gets him arrested, booted back to Italy, and then, because he clearly didn't learn his lesson, he goes back to Switzerland, gets arrested again, and is finally forced to do his military service anyway. Once that's over, it's straight back to his old socialist stomping grounds. His anti-war rhetoric was legendary. He threw massive tantrums, organized riots, to protest Italy's colonization of Libya. When World War I rolled around, he was at the forefront, protesting Italy's involvement. But then, in a plot twist worthy of a soap opera, he completely flips the script. Suddenly, he starts thinking, hey, maybe this war isn't so bad after all. Maybe it has the perfect spark to ignite the socialist revolution we've all been dreaming of, and finally kick those pesky monarchies to the curb. His socialist buddies were not amused. They looked at his new pro-war attitude, said, "You've changed, man," and promptly kicked him out of the club. Left without a political home, Mussolini decided to create his own, abandoning socialism for a shiny new idea, unity based on nationality. His grand plan, to conquer the entire Mediterranean and reunite all the Italian peoples under one glorious banner, just like the good old Roman Empire. He called this new ideology fascism. Meanwhile, Italy, despite technically being on the winning side of World War I, felt like it got the short end of the stick in the peace treaty. This, combined with a garbage economy and a government weaker than a wet paper bag, left the Italian people feeling pretty miserable. Seizing the moment, Mussolini's fascist movement started gaining some serious traction. In 1922, he marched on Rome in a move that screamed subtlety is for losers. Demanded the king make him prime minister. The king caved, and before long Mussolini had established a full-blown dictatorship. Europe, meet your very first fascist dictator. Over in Germany, things were even worse. The Treaty of Versailles had absolutely wrecked the country. They lost a ton of territory. The Rhineland was demilitarized. Their army was shrunk to the size of a boy band, and they were saddled with enough debt to make your eyes water. A terrible economy and an equally ineffective government created the perfect power vacuum for a small, intensely angry man with a very silly mustache to rise to prominence. You guessed it, Adolf Hitler. Hitler, who had been a fanatically patriotic soldier during World War I, was absolutely livid about Germany's humiliation. He got involved in politics, helping to start a new political party. After a failed attempt to march on Munich in 1923, he got himself arrested. But instead of fading into obscurity, his time in prison only made him more popular. By 1933, the political establishment, thinking they could control him, made him chancellor. Big mistake. Convinced he was Germany's destined savior, Hitler wasted no time in establishing a dictatorship with himself at the very center. And just like that, Europe had its second fascist dictator. While these two were bonding over their mutual hatred of the post-war order, halfway across the world, Japan had its own expansionist agenda, having already taken over northern China. Let's talk about Japan. After being isolated for 200 years, they were rudely forced to open up for trade by the Americans, which led to a series of unequal treaties, a busted economy, and a severe lack of natural resources. Their solution: go to war with China to gain influence over Korea and snatch up some Chinese assets. The Western powers, however, stepped in and told them to knock it off. Reluctantly, Japan backed down, but the resentment was brewing. Japan looked at the Western powers with their own spheres of influence across Asia and felt incredibly cheated. It was like they had done all the hard work of weakening China, only for the cool kids to swoop in and take all the credit. Fed up, Japan said, "Screw this," and went to war with Russia, in a move that stunned the entire world. They won. With their newfound confidence, they went ahead and fully annexed Korea. During World War I, Japan scooped up Germany's colonies in Asia. Then, in 1931, they staged a bomb attack on a Japanese-owned railway in Manchuria, giving themselves the perfect excuse to invade and take over the entire region. So, to recap the situation, we have Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. All three nations believed they were racially superior. All harbored deep hostility towards the Allies, and all were itching to militarize and conquer more territory. Hitler, who hated the Treaty of Versailles with the passion of 1,000 burning suns, immediately started to undo it. He established the Luftwaffe, Germany's new air force, brought back military conscription, and began pimping out his army with all the latest gear. The Allies, meanwhile, did absolutely nothing. Next, he sent his army marching back into the demilitarized Rhineland with strict orders to retreat. If the Allies showed up, the Allies, once again, did nothing. With his military back in business, Hitler moved on to step 2 of his master plan, acquiring Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people. This basically meant he started eyeing up his neighbors, which finally made the Allies a little nervous. Their brilliant response was a diplomatic strategy called appeasement, which was about as effective as trying to put out a forest fire with a water pistol. The process went something like this. Hitler would demand something, the Allies would say no, then they'd give it to him anyway, but wag their finger and say, okay, but no more. In 1938, Hitler's army marched into Austria and, facing zero resistance, took it over. Boom! Austria was now part of Germany. His next target was the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a large German-speaking population. This time, the Allies decided to hold a meeting with Hitler in Munich. They all sat down, had some tea, and agreed to give him exactly what he wanted. They even had him sign a piece of paper promising he wouldn't invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned home, waving the paper triumphantly and declaring he had secured peace for our time. A few months later, Hitler invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia anyway. Shocking, I know. So, where were we? Ah yes, the best of the Allied forces were completely cornered, trapped with their backs to the sea at Dunkirk. The Germans were squeezing in from all sides, and it looked like game over. But then, in a move that historians would later call a miracle, but was more like a ridiculously desperate and chaotic scramble, the British managed to pull off a last-minute escape. They commandeered everything that could float, fishing boats, pleasure yachts, you name it, and evacuated over 300,000 soldiers back to Britain. It was a heroic feat, but let's be clear, it was a retreat, a massive, humiliating retreat. They left behind tons of equipment, and the French were left holding the bag. With the British Expeditionary Force gone, and the remaining French forces severely depleted and demoralized, the German war machine just breezed through the rest of France. It was less of a fight and more of a victory lap. They took Paris without a struggle, and soon after, France officially surrendered. Hitler was feeling pretty pleased with himself. He stood in front of the Eiffel Tower for a photo op, probably thinking, well, that was easy. He genuinely believed that with France out of the picture, the UK would finally see sense and sue for peace. After all, what could they possibly do? They were alone, an island nation facing the might of his seemingly unstoppable army. The war was surely over. Annoyingly for Hitler, and rather inconveniently for his victory parade plans, the UK did not, in fact, sue for peace. Winston Churchill, the new prime minister, a man who looked like a grumpy bulldog and had the same level of tenacity, got on the radio and basically told Hitler to get stuffed. He gave a series of speeches that were so epic, they probably made the cliffs of Dover stand a little straighter. He promised the British people nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat, and vowed to fight on the beaches. Fight on the landing grounds, ... fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender. This was not the response Hitler was expecting. To make matters even worse for the British, Italy's dictator Mussolini, seeing which way the wind was blowing, decided it was the perfect time to jump on the bandwagon. He declared war on the Allies, suddenly making the Mediterranean a very dangerous place for the Royal Navy and threatening British colonies in North Africa. The UK's situation went from dire to for crying out loud, seriously. Hitler, meanwhile, decided on a strategy for France. He didn't want the hassle of occupying the entire country, so he occupied the strategically important northern and coastal areas, leaving the rest of the country to be governed as a German puppet state. This new entity was headquartered in the city of Vichy and became known as Vichy France, led by Marshal Pétain, an aging World War I hero. On the surface, it was an independent French government, but in reality, it was completely beholden to Germany. This arrangement was particularly galling for the French, but it also created a new, complicated problem for the British. What about the French Navy? It was one of the largest in the world, and if it fell into German hands, it would be a catastrophe for Britain. The UK's response to the Vichy France problem was swift, brutal, and deeply controversial. Churchill couldn't risk the French fleet being seized by the Germans, so he made a decision that would strain relations with his former ally to the breaking point. The Royal Navy sailed to the French naval base at Mers el Kabir in Algeria, where a large portion of the French fleet was anchored. They gave the French commander an ultimatum: either sail your ships to a British port, scuttle them, or we will open fire. The French commander refused, feeling it was a betrayal of his honor. So, the British did exactly what they said they would do. They opened fire on their former allies, wrecking a bunch of ships and killing over 1,200 French sailors. It was a grim, ugly business, but from Churchill's perspective, it was a necessary evil to ensure Britain's survival. Back in Berlin, Hitler, now realizing the British weren't going to roll over, began planning for a full-scale invasion of Great Britain. The plan was codenamed Operation Sea Lion, but before he could send a single soldier across the English Channel, he knew he had to achieve two things: complete air superiority and naval superiority. The Royal Navy was still a formidable force, so the first and most crucial step was to destroy the Royal Air Force, and so began the Battle of Britain. Waves upon waves of German bombers, the Luftwaffe, escorted by swarms of Messerschmitt fighters, began crossing the channel. The outnumbered RAF, with its iconic Spitfires and Hurricanes, scrambled to meet them in the skies day after day. It was a relentless, around-the-clock battle for survival. Initially, the Luftwaffe strategy was sound. They focused their attacks on coastal shipping, ports, and, most importantly, RAF airfields and radar stations in the south of England. The goal was to cripple the RAF on the ground and in the air, to grind them down through sheer attrition, and it was working. The RAF was losing pilots and planes at an unsustainable rate. Pilots were flying multiple sorties a day, exhausted and pushed to their absolute limits. The hangars were burning, the runways were cratered, and it looked very much like the Great British Invasion was just around the corner. The situation was desperate, but then, something happened. A moment of pure, unadulterated hubris that would change the course of the battle. In late August, a few German bombers, having gotten lost in the dark, accidentally dropped their bombs on London. It was a mistake, not part of the plan. In response, Churchill, ever the opportunist, ordered a small, militarily insignificant bombing raid on Berlin. It did very little actual damage, but the psychological impact was enormous. Berliners were stunned. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, had famously boasted that if a single enemy bomb ever fell on Berlin, "You can call me Meyer." Well, it was time to start calling him Meyer. Hitler was absolutely incandescent with rage. An attack on his capital, the heart of the Reich? Unthinkable. It was a personal insult, and he was not a man who took insults well. In a fit of fury, he immediately ordered a change in strategy. He stood before a cheering crowd and screamed that for every bomb the British dropped, he would drop 100 more. The Luftwaffe was to immediately refocus its attacks away from the battered RAF airfields and instead target civilian centers, starting with London. This new phase of the bombing campaign became known as the Blitz. Night after night, the sirens would wail, and Londoners would huddle in underground stations and Anderson shelters as the bombs rained down. The city burned. But something incredible happened. British morale, which Hitler expected to shatter, held firm. Londoners, with their characteristic stoicism and grim humor, just picked themselves up, dusted themselves off, and carried on. The Blitz spirit was born. Crucially, this shift in focus from military to civilian targets was a colossal strategic blunder. Hitler had, in his rage, shot himself in the foot. The relentless pressure on the RAF was suddenly lifted. This gave Fighter Command the breathing space it desperately needed to repair its airfields, train new pilots, and get its battered squadrons back to full strength. The Germans, however, believed the RAF was on its last legs. On September 15, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched what it hoped would be the final, decisive blow. A massive, all-out daylight attack on London, involving hundreds of bombers and fighters. They expected to sweep aside the last remnants of the RAF and finally clear the way for Operation Sea Lion. But the RAF wasn't broken. It was rested, reorganized, and ready. As the huge German formations appeared over Kent, they were met by a force of Spitfires and Hurricanes far larger than they could have imagined. The sky became a chaotic maelstrom of dogfights. The RAF, fighting with the ferocity of a cornered animal defending its home, tore into the German bomber fleets. The Luftwaffe suffered devastating losses. It was a stunning, decisive victory for the RAF. They had successfully repelled the attack, proving to the Germans and to themselves that they still controlled the skies. Air superiority was now firmly in British hands. 2 days later, Hitler was forced to accept the inevitable. The invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, was postponed indefinitely. It would never happen. He had failed to break the RAF and had failed to break the spirit of the British people. The Battle of Britain was over, and it was the first major defeat for Nazi Germany in the war. Britain was safe from invasion, for now. However, this didn't mean the suffering was over. The bombing of British cities, the Blitz, would continue for many more months, bringing death and destruction night after night. But the immediate threat had passed. Britain had survived, alone, against all odds. Churchill famously summed it up: "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." He was talking about the RAF pilots, the brave young men who had won the battle in the skies and saved the nation. The war was far from over, but a crucial turning point had been reached. The second phase of the war quickly revealed just how deep Britain's pockets really were. Thanks to the Commonwealth nations and various allied colonies chipping in with crucial manpower and resources, this support was especially handy for the little side quests in Africa and Italy. Meanwhile, the Axis powers Germany, Italy, and Japan decided to make their alliance official with the Tripartite Pact, a defensive agreement that, in practice, mostly meant they agreed to stay out of each other's way in their own little sandboxes. The Soviet Union, fresh off a truly embarrassing performance against Finland in the Winter War, had inadvertently broadcasted its military incompetence to the world. Hitler, watching from the sidelines, took this as a sign that the Red Army was a pushover, a miscalculation of catastrophic proportions that would come back to bite him. Having barely scraped by with a win, the Soviets then went on a strategic shopping spree, opportunistically annexing the Baltic states and parts of northern Romania to beef up their borders, proving that even a humbling victory can be a great motivator for a little real estate acquisition. The strategic importance of global real estate was also on full display in Africa, where most of French Equatorial Africa decided to side with Free France. This global tug-of-war for resources and strategic ports led to some comical failures, like the Allies' botched attempt to take Dakar. Speaking of failures, Mussolini decided to launch his own independent campaigns, a decision that proved to be a military liability of the highest order. His spectacular inability to secure victories in British Somaliland, Egypt, and most disastrously in Greece, earned Italy the not-so-flattering nickname of Europe's soft underbelly. Seeing Mussolini flail, Churchill decided to lean into a peripheral strategy, sending British troops to Greece. The idea was to tie up Axis forces in a southern sideshow, far away from the main event in Europe. Hitler, however, was not amused. Worried that Mussolini's blunders would expose his southern flank, he aggressively moved to secure the Balkans. He strong-armed nations like Hungary and Romania into joining the Axis, and then, for good measure, invaded Yugoslavia and Greece, basically cleaning up his alliés' mess. The signing of the Tripartite Pact wasn't just about Axis solidarity. It was a strategic keep-out sign, aimed squarely at Britain's old pal, the resource-rich United States. Across the pond, public opinion was strongly against joining another European brawl. President Roosevelt, a master of political maneuvering, cleverly navigated this sentiment by promising not to intervene, unless I have to, a wonderfully vague phrase that kept all his strategic options open. Soon enough, the U.S. transformed into the arsenal of democracy, shipping critical food and munitions to the Allies under the Lend-Lease Act. This move strategically hitched America's industrial wagon to the Allied cause, a commitment that didn't go unnoticed. This lifeline, however, was under constant threat from German U-boats prowling the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic became a brutal campaign of attrition, a desperate struggle to sever Britain's supply line and starve the island nation into submission. To counter the U-boat menace, the Allies poured resources into technology, developing better radar, long-range aircraft, and superior convoy tactics that slowly began to turn the tide. But the real game-changer, the ultimate cheat code in the Atlantic War, was the intelligence coup of cracking Germany's Enigma code. This provided the crucial signal intelligence, where SIGINT needed to outmaneuver and systematically dismantle the U-boat threat. Back in Africa, the British managed to push Italy out of Egypt, which of course forced Hitler to step in and send Rommel's tank divisions to bail out his failing ally. It was a classic case of an Allies' incompetence requiring the main forces to clean up the mess. Hitler's subsequent Balkan invasion was a necessary detour before his main event, Operation Barbarossa. He used the threat of invasion to secure supply lines through Bulgaria, while steamrolling a resistant Yugoslavia and ultimately conquering Greece. The decision to shift British troops to Greece, however, left the door wide open for Rommel, a brilliant tactician. He seized the opportunity and pushed the British right back to Egypt. A textbook example of the risks of splitting your forces between too many theaters. Yet a small, mostly Australian force held out stubbornly at Tobruk. Their defense was strategically vital, denying the Germans a critical port city and royally screwing up their supply lines, which significantly slowed their advance. Then came the main event, Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union was the largest ground invasion in history, a monumental strategic gamble driven by a toxic cocktail of ideology and a desire for Lebensraum, or living space. Stalin, despite receiving repeated warnings from Churchill and Roosevelt, refused to believe them. This was a catastrophic intelligence failure of epic proportions, leaving the Soviet military completely unprepared for the staggering initial onslaught of the German Blitzkrieg. The Germans achieved spectacular early success, executing massive encirclements that demonstrated brutally effective maneuver warfare and captured Soviet troops in numbers never before seen. Fueled by ideological hatred, the war on the Eastern Front was fought with a level of brutality that was off the charts, a direct reflection of Hitler's goal to utterly destroy the Soviet state and its people. As German forces closed in on Moscow, Hitler made his single most critical strategic error. He grossly underestimated both the Russian environment and his enemy's capacity for endurance. The infamous Russian winter arrived, and Hitler, in his infinite wisdom, refused to let his commanders dig in and resupply. What was once a strategic advance quickly devolved into a logistical nightmare. Lacking winter clothing, and with their equipment literally freezing solid, the German forces were devastated. It was a classic, almost cliché, failure of linear logistics in a vast and unforgiving theater. Just as things looked their bleakest, Stalin unleashed his secret weapon, specially trained Siberian troops. This marked the first decisive Soviet counteroffensive, which pushed the weakened, freezing German forces back and forced them onto the defensive. Meanwhile, watching Germany's early triumphs, Japan decided it was time to expand its own sphere of influence. Their goal was to secure crucial raw materials in Southeast Asia, which meant they had to neutralize US and UK naval power in the Pacific first. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a massive, calculated risk. Tactically, it was a success, crippling the immediate US fleet. Strategically, however, it was a colossal failure. It failed to destroy the naval fuel storage or submarine base, and more importantly, it galvanized the furious United States into action. Roosevelt and Churchill immediately declared war on Japan. In a move not required by their treaty, Hitler then foolishly declared war on the United States, officially committing the Axis to the unwinnable reality of a devastating two-front war against the world's emerging industrial superpower. While the Axis was busy getting bogged down in Russia, Japan, seeing a golden opportunity, decided it was time for a tropical vacation, with a side of violent expansion. They swiftly kicked the Americans out of Guam and the Philippines, booted the British from Hong Kong, and went on a grand tour of Southeast Asia, all with a speed and efficiency that was frankly just showing off. This whirlwind of victories did wonders for their national ego, reinforcing the already popular idea that they were on a divine mission from the emperor himself. However, this entire strategy was built on the shaky foundation of a quick, decisive war. It was a blitzkrieg on water, a high-stakes gamble that they could win before the Allies, particularly the industrially colossal United States, could properly wake up, get their factories running, and start churning out boats and planes like they were sausages. Life under the rising sun wasn't the tropical paradise the travel brochures might have implied. The Japanese military occupation was a brutal affair, characterized by widespread persecution and the enthusiastic use of forced labor. Unsurprisingly, this didn't go over well with the locals, who responded by forming fierce resistance movements. These guerrilla groups became a persistent, bleeding ulcer for the Japanese, tying down troops and resources that could have been used elsewhere. Back in Europe, as the Russian winter finally decided to take a break, Hitler, in a moment of strategic brilliance, or perhaps just plain greed, changed his mind. He looked at Moscow, the symbolic heart of the Soviet Union, and then looked south towards the Caucasus and its vast oil fields, and thought, you know what? Forget political subjugation. I could really use a top-up. This pivot to the south was driven by an overconfidence that was bordering on delusional. So sure was Hitler of a quick victory that he prematurely ordered the 4th Panzer Army to peel off and head south, leaving the poor old 6th Army to wrap things up at a city named after Stalin himself. Stalingrad, a place that would soon become a byword for hell on earth, was now the main event. What was supposed to be a swift capture devolved into a 5-month-long meat grinder. The Germans, masters of open-field maneuver warfare, were now stuck in a brutal house-to-house slugfest. This agonizingly slow advance was a godsend for the Soviets, giving them precious time to get their act together, rebuild their shattered armies, and fire up the new industrial base they'd conveniently relocated beyond the Ural Mountains. Stalin, not one to miss a trick, decided to give Hitler a taste of his own medicine. Using the fresh armies he'd been quietly assembling, he launched a massive pincer movement, perfectly mirroring the Germans' own favorite tactic, and snapped a trap shut around the entire 6th Army. The result was a catastrophic surrender for Germany, a humiliation that marked the decisive turning point on the Eastern Front. With America now fully in the game and its factories running 24/7, the skies over Germany started to get very crowded. Allied strategic bombing campaigns reached a devastating new intensity, systematically pulverizing German cities, crippling war production, and doing wonders for civilian morale, if by wonders you mean utterly crushing it. Meanwhile, in the sunny climes of North Africa, the Allies decided to try a pincer movement of their own. The British, advancing from the east after a smashing victory at El Alamein, linked up with American and British forces landing in the west during Operation Torch. This continental-sized squeeze play neatly popped the Axis right out of Africa, forcing them to take an involuntary swim back to Italy. Over in the Pacific, the naval war reached its own climax. At the Battle of Midway, the U.S. Navy, having cleverly figured out the Japanese plan, managed to sink 4 of Japan's best aircraft carriers in a single day. This wasn't just a defeat, it was a naval catastrophe from which the Imperial Japanese Navy would never recover, effectively ending their ability to launch major offensive operations. With Africa secured, the Allies debated what to do next. The Americans were keen on a direct punch to the gut of Nazi Germany through France. But Churchill, ever the cautious one, favored nibbling around the edges. They compromised on what he poetically called the soft underbelly of Europe, Italy. The plan was to land in Sicily, a move they hoped would be a strategic sideshow. As it turned out, the Germans took the bait, diverting precious divisions to Italy that they desperately needed on the Eastern Front. The invasion of Sicily itself was less of a battle and more of a welcoming parade. The locals, thoroughly fed up with Mussolini and the war, greeted the Allied troops with open arms. The combination of the invasion and a few well-placed bombing raids on Rome was enough to shatter what was left of Italian morale, leading to Mussolini being unceremoniously overthrown and Italy promptly surrendering. Hitler, however, was not amused by his allies' sudden change of heart. He launched Operation Axis, a swift and brutal response that involved sending German reinforcements pouring south to disarm the Italian army. In a flash, Italy went from being an Axis partner to an occupied territory, and the soft underbelly campaign transformed into a slow, grinding, and incredibly costly slog up the mountainous Italian peninsula. With the Italian front bogged down in a miserable stalemate, the Americans finally got their way. The main event, the big one, was on Operation Overlord. The D-Day invasion of France was prepared with a logistical buildup in England so massive it practically threatened to sink the entire island. To give themselves a fighting chance, the Allies put on a masterclass in deception. They created a phantom army complete with inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic, brilliantly convincing the Germans that the main invasion would land at Calais. The German high command fell for it, hook, line, and sinker, keeping their best panzer divisions waiting for an invasion that would never come. When the real landings happened in Normandy, it was a stunning feat of joint operations. Paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines to sow chaos, while a massive armada delivered waves of infantry onto the beaches. Despite horrendous losses, particularly on a stretch of sand codenamed Omaha, the beachheads were secured. The subsequent breakout from Normandy was slow and bloody, but the capture of the crucial port of Cherbourg and the grinding battle for Caen finally opened the way. This led to the brilliant execution of the Falaise Pocket, a classic encirclement that trapped and effectively annihilated the German 7th Army in France. With Paris liberated and the Allies racing towards Belgium, the war's focus shifted back to the Pacific. There, the Americans were engaged in a brutal island-hopping campaign, a grim, step-by-step advance designed to secure air bases ever closer to the Japanese mainland. This strategy ran headfirst into the Japanese military code, where surrender was considered the ultimate dishonor. The result was a series of nightmarishly ferocious battles for every tiny, strategically insignificant speck of rock and coral, making the Allied advance a slow and incredibly costly affair. Back in Europe, Hitler, his health failing and his grip on reality slipping, decided to roll the dice one last time. He scraped together the last of Germany's reserves for a final, desperate gamble in the Ardennes forest, the Battle of the Bulge. The plan was to punch through the American lines, split the Allied armies, and somehow force a negotiated peace. It was a bold, all-or-nothing offensive that managed to catch the Allies completely by surprise. However, the heroic, desperate defense by American troops at key crossroads like Bastogne, combined with the offensive's sheer overreach, meant the gamble failed. It succeeded only in utterly exhausting Germany's last mobile reserves, burning up precious fuel, and dramatically accelerating the final collapse. With the failure of the Bulge, the end came quickly. The Allies pushed into Germany from the west, while the vast Soviet war machine, having chewed its way across Eastern Europe, closed in on Berlin from the east. The ultimate nightmare for German strategists, a two-front war had become a grim reality, culminating in a race to the capital, the fall of Berlin, a brutal street-by-street fight to the finish. And Hitler's subsequent suicide in his bunker marked the final ignominious end of the thousand-year Reich in Europe. Yet, the war wasn't over. The assault on Okinawa, the last major island before Japan, was a horrific preview of what a mainland invasion would look like. It was met with fanatical resistance, including waves of kamikaze suicide attacks, which confirmed the military's projections of catastrophic casualties for the planned Operation Downfall. Then, a new, terrible option presented itself. In the deserts of New Mexico, the Manhattan Project successfully tested the atomic bomb. This terrifying new weapon offered a way to force Japan's surrender.